Tonight the topic is about North Korea, with a question mark at Justice Kirby's request. It's about whether security and human rights are incompatible, question mark. Michael Kirby is a very famous international jurist, educator, former judge, former president of the now I think defunct Australian Conciliation and Arbitration Commission, a president of the Law Reform Commission, a judge of the Federal Court of Australia, a judge of appeal of the Federal Court of Australia, and of course a judge of the High Court from 1996 to 2009. In the 24/7 schedule that Michael lives, he's still managed to do all sorts of work and undertakings for the United Nations, for the Commonwealth Commission, for the UNDP global program to combat AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, and is a commissioner on HIV, AIDS and the law. Now, but for our purposes tonight, he's the chair and co-author of a report on North Korea, which is concerned with the issue of security and human rights, even though the word human rights doesn't actually appear in the subtitle. In addition to that, if you can believe it or not, Michael is a honorary professor at a dozen or more Australian and overseas universities, which, it won't surprise you, means he did not have any time at all to be involved in the Liberal Party leadership crisis, even if he'd been slightly interested. But due to his generosity, he has found time to come to this august forum. Please welcome Michael Kirby.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and I too would like to begin by paying acknowledgement to the Indigenous people of Australia, both in this part of the country and all over our continental land. We're getting better at doing that, like the New Zealanders. The New Zealanders are very sincere, and they can actually always launch into a little bit of Maori. Even the Pākehā can speak a little bit of Maori, but we haven't refined our skills in that respect. But as a lawyer and a former judge, it's appropriate that I say that a lot of the wrongs that were done to the Indigenous people were done by the law. And it's important to note that the great wrong of depriving them of recognition of their land rights was never fixed up by an Australian parliament. We have some of the longest serving parliaments in the world, going back to 1856, but in the end it was the High Court of Australia, of unelected judges, who recognised Indigenous rights to land. Now, I'm here tonight to talk about some work that I did for the United Nations Human Rights Council, and that was on human rights violations of North Korea. I want to apologise to you for being a little late. I thought the starting time was 6:30, but it was 6:15. And I'll therefore speak more quickly so that I can get everything I want to say said before I'm thrown out of here.
No.
Now, the inquiry was actually quite interesting, because generally when the UN sets up a commission of inquiry, it's a very political hot potato. And generally a vote is taken, and the votes are very divisive. But in the case of North Korea, there had been so many reports of horrible things happening inside North Korea that it's the only time that the Human Rights Council has established a commission of inquiry without anyone calling for a vote. The president of the council at the time was the ambassador of Poland, and he paused 3 times to see if anybody was calling for a vote, but nobody called for a vote. and the Commission of Inquiry was established. I was actually at a conference of statisticians in England when I was telephoned and asked would I allow my name to go forward to be a member and chair of the Commission of Inquiry, but I agreed to that, and so my two colleagues were first Marzuki Darusman, who was the former Attorney General and Prosecutor General of Indonesia, a man who spoke perfect English and was very experienced with criminal trials and serious trials in Indonesia. And the other member was Sonia Beserko, who was a member of civil society concerned with issues of genocide in Serbia. So we three were the commissioners of the inquiry. We were independent of the UN in the sense that we didn't take our running orders or instruction on what should be decided from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And we were assigned a team to help us with our investigation. They were mostly youngish lawyers. They were extremely hard-working, and they were very dedicated to finding out exactly what was going on in North Korea. We very politely asked if we could go to North Korea. We never for a minute expected they would agree. Their strategy had been for 20 years in dealing with the UN human rights machinery to simply ignore requests for any cooperation or opportunities to go inside. But in the end that didn't matter much, because in the last 20 years approximately 30,000 people have fled from North Korea, mostly in the north, going up to the Yalu River, and in the winter when the Yalu freezes, they could get across, get into China, get involved in escape lines, go down to Laos or Thailand, and then if they could get on a plane to South Korea with some help, they have a constitutional right under the Constitution of South Korea to citizenship, and they would go through a debrief to make sure that they weren't spies for North Korea, and then if they passed that, they would be given quite a sizable amount of money, because South Korea's, as you know, one of the most successful economies in the world. It's remarkable what they've achieved in a short time. So they would get money, they would get housing, and then they would try to get work in South Korea. We had a lot of witnesses. In the end, we had to cut off the witnesses, because otherwise we would not have been able to get our report out in the effectively 7 months that we had to get the report before the Human Rights Council on St. Patrick's Day of 2014. And we completed our report. We held public hearings, which is not usual in the UN, but it's the way we do inquiries in the English-speaking world. We have public hearings so that the issue that is being addressed can be seen and the people who are interested can see what the witnesses say. We, with the permission of the witnesses, and where it was safe, where they didn't have family that were endangered in North Korea, they agreed with us that we could film them, and the film testimony was recorded and was put online. And if you're very interested in this, you can Google UN Commission of Inquiry on North Korea, and you can sit there for days watching the testimony. And actually, it reminded me very much, I don't know if any of you have gone to a Holocaust museum in Europe. There are a number of Holocaust museums, and if you go there, people who went through the terrible suffering of the Jewish people at the hands of the Nazis. They are recorded telling their stories, and it's really amazing to somebody from Australia, I suppose anybody, to see these mostly very old people who were captured on film in a very matter-of-fact, low-key way, telling the most horrendous stories of what happened to them, just factually. They have it in their head, they have it chronologically, they go through what happened, and it's all recorded, and that's what the people came before us and told us what had happened to them. It made me feel, as a person who'd been a judge for 34 years in Australia, like those scenes that I saw as a young boy on movie tone news of General Eisenhower and General Montgomery turning up at the terrible camps in Nazi-occupied Europe. And this is what it felt like to get the stories of North Korea. Terrible system of detention camps. Anybody who was suspected to be an enemy of the regime would be sent into detention camps. Some people claimed that there were 1 million people in detention camps. We didn't accept that. We thought it was probably more like 150,000, but it was still a lot of people. They are outside the general criminal system and the criminal prisons, but they had a system in North Korea that often, if they put inside a person who was suspected to be unreliable or a traitor to the regime, they'd put in their parents and they put in their children, so that the idea was to remove the infection from society. They conduct a lot of public executions. Young people came before us and said, as school children, we were rounded up to witness these public executions, which were making a point for them. And we hated it because the blood and the bone would from the shooting would scatter all over us, but we had to turn up and see this. Women suffered very greatly in North Korea. When they went across the Yalu River in the winter, they would then have to have livelihood, so they would fall in with families. In China, there's a great shortage of women, and therefore they would fall into the sex trade, not trafficked, but just to survive. They would provide a household and sexual services, and they would get food, and they would survive for a while longer until they could get onto the escape lines. There was no freedom of the press, there was no freedom of television. There's no access to the internet except for the hierarchy of the Korean Workers' Party, and the army in North Korea is the third largest standing army in the world. It's something greater than 1 million, and there was a huge turnout of them last Monday on the 75th anniversary of the revolution. So anyway, we had our inquiry. We were very cautious about the witnesses because, in a sense, they were self-selecting themselves as critics of the regime, and they were coming forward, but they were so matter-of-fact about what had happened to them and to their families, and their evidence tended to corroborate each other, that we were convinced that overwhelmingly they were telling us the truth, and the truth was pretty horrible. So we prepared our report, we delivered it to the United Nations Human Rights Council. The ambassador for North Korea turned up, and they have a system in the UN that they rotate the states so that they go from the front of the room to the back in alphabetical order, and the ambassador turned up, and here was I sitting on the podium like this, which I'm quite used to sitting on because I'd had 34 years of it, and he was just sitting there. And I thought, should I go over and introduce myself to him? And so I thought, oh, that might be a bit complicated, but then I thought, look, you were brought up correctly in Australia, so you go over there and offer your hand. So I went over there and I offered my hand. He immediately looked everywhere in the room in case there were cameras that were taking a picture of him, but he shook my hand, and I said, I hope one day we will meet in circumstances where it isn't like today. And anyway, he sat down. He ultimately said, we have a saying in Korea, mind your own business. And I had to tell him what I had learned at Summerhill Public School when I was a schoolboy in Sydney, that after the Second World War and after Eleanor Roosevelt's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the human rights of people in every country is everybody's business, and that's the only way. It's the only way in which we're going to avoid blasting ourselves to smithereens with the huge weapons that became available at the very end of the Second World War over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we made a lot of recommendations. Some of them were recommendations which are really quite small and could have been done, such as introduce a postal service between North and South Korea, introduce telephone connections, and reintroduce railway systems, have sister city arrangements, allow civil society organisations, allow universities to swap personnel, and so on, all of which were rejected out of hand by North Korea. But we also recommended that there were crimes against humanity. We didn't find genocide, because genocide under the UN Genocide Convention has to be done on the basis of race, nationality, ethnicity or religion. So the Genocide Convention really grew out of the Jewish sufferings in the Second World War, race, ethnicity, nationality or religion. And what was done to people in North Korea wasn't on any of those grounds. It was done basically on political grounds or deemed political opinion as enemies of the regime. So we recommended that there should be a referral to the International Criminal Court, and that we didn't name any people that should be referred, but I did, when sending the report to Kim Jong-un via their embassy in Geneva, I did remind him that under international law, if a person having the power to stop crimes against humanity does not use that power, then that person can be liable in international law for the crimes that then ensue, even though they don't actually do the crimes. If they have the power to stop them and don't stop them, then they are responsible. Now the report, because it was done in a different way, it was done basically in an Australian way, the way we did the inquiry into sexual abuse by public institutions or the Banking Royal Commission now. You know how it's done here. It's done in public. It's done in the open. And that was caused a sensation in the UN, because they never do it that way. They always do it in the civil law tradition, behind closed doors and in private. Well, there was none of that. Everything was out and everything was hanging out, and we did it all in public, and it's on the internet. People can see it, except in North Korea where they can't get access. And so we recommended that these steps be taken. The report was strongly endorsed by the Human Rights Council. It then went to the General Assembly and was very strongly endorsed by the General Assembly. And then, most unusually, it went to the Security Council. It's very rare for the Security Council to get involved in human rights issues because they tend to be very divisive in the international community, but that's what they did. They put it on the agenda of the Security Council, and it's still there. And I think the fact that the report was so powerful that led to China and Russia agreeing to the sanctions that were imposed on North Korea, and those sanctions were gradually stepped up. And although at first they weren't being enforced by China, in the last 2 years China has been enforcing the sanctions that were established by the Security Council, and the consequence of that has been that the trade and the export, mainly of coal from North Korea into China, has really drained to a dribble, and that puts a lot of pressure on Kim Jong-un, and that, I think, is what led to the steps that resulted in the meeting in Singapore on the 12th of June. Now, when that meeting was announced, I must admit that I was torn myself about it. On the one hand, because North Korea has astonishingly developed 20 nuclear weapons and remarkably developed intercontinental ballistic missiles of great sophistication and ability that can deliver nuclear weapons over thousands of kilometres, possibly to the west coast of the United States. These developments mean that a strategy of not talking to each other is really very dangerous, because mistakes and accidents can happen, or just somebody can have a tizzy or a rage, and then we're into the awful prospects of nuclear catastrophe. So on the one hand, I was glad that Mr. Trump and Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader in North Korea, agreed to meet. But when you actually looked at what the great deal maker secured, it was 4 points. Point number one was that the United States and North Korea would work towards improving their relations, and in particular in respect of the war games that they have. And so that was the first point, which was a sensible enough point. Number two was that they would work to implement an agreement which, just before they met, Kim Jong-un and President Moon Jae-in, the new president of South Korea, had agreed that there would be a strong inter-Korean dialogue. So that was another good point. And then came the crunch. Number four was simply that they would return the remains of prisoners of war or missing in action people to the United States. But number three was the lynch point, and it said they would work towards denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Work towards. That was a very soft obligation. Work towards can mean an awful lot of things to a lot of people. And there were no deadlines, there were no timelines, there was no specificity about what would be done, there were no steps that had to be taken by a certain time. And in the miasma of joy unbounded in Singapore in June, they parted and they agreed that they would have meetings, and so Mr. Pompeo, the Secretary of State of the United States, went out there and met in Panmunjom at the armistice line, and they have had discussions. But work towards doesn't have any clarity about it, and it's very time open. And meantime, there has been no apparent reduction of the nuclear weapons. Some people, some commentators say that in his bathroom back there in his palace in Pyongyang, Kim Jong-un has two photographs. One, the photograph of Saddam Hussein climbing out of a hole in Iraq when he was ultimately captured, and the other of Muammar Gaddafi climbing out of a pipe in central Libya when he was captured. And I think it's a fair assumption that Kim Jong-un is not going to do anything to surrender the nuclear weapons until it's very, very clear that he's not going to end up in a pipe or in a hole. And so Mr. Trump keeps demanding denuclearization. A report this week said that the Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs of China had urged North Korea to conform to the promise of denuclearization and to produce evidence of it. But how that can be done without some guarantees for Mr. Kim remains to be seen. There was no mention of human rights, of the human rights of the people of North Korea in the deal. And in fact, that wasn't mentioned because if it's ever mentioned, that raises the question as to what's going to happen to those who may be responsible for it, who are under the control of Chairman Kim Jong-un. So that is where we find ourselves at the moment. Was it a good thing that they met in Singapore? Yes, I think it was a good thing, because not playing a game of no speaks when you're in the possession of 20 nuclear warheads and intercontinental ballistic missiles is not a good look. Did they strike a good deal? Not really, because it's very vague, very uncertain, very open-ended, and nothing appears to have happened that amounts to moving towards denuclearization, to such an extent that China is now reported as saying, you've got to do something here or you're going to lose this deal. So what is going to happen? I don't know. Is anything going to happen to advance the human rights of the people of North Korea? Well, we got a bit of a clue about that when they had the recent meeting. In North Korea, there are very large numbers of people who have family in South Korea. For 1,000, 2,000 years, it was the one country. And so there are people in North Korea who want to see their family, but the North has introduced a form of lottery, and you've got to make a bid. And about 300 people were allowed to meet. But there are many people in North Korea who are now in their 80s and 90s. I don't know if you saw any of the people in that exchange. I found it really distressing to watch them. They are all these very old people in their 80s and 90s who hadn't seen their relatives since the Korean War, so that's 70 years, just sobbing because they only got a few hours, and that it's really a rather barbarous thing to do that to human beings when we live in an age where there can be instant, immediate Skype or other contact, but that's not permitted. So that is the story of North Korea. All wrong is not on the side of the North. The North was carpet bombed. So many people in the North lost their families. The North hates the Americans because of the carpet bombing. And if only we had somebody in charge of all this who could work out a way to approach a new era in the Korean Peninsula, something like the Marshall Plan, something that was generous, something that would spend the money on helping develop society instead of on hugely costly weapons and hugely dangerous weapons. If only we could do something like that, then there would have to be some accounting for the human rights wrongs. But some arrangement could be made that gave accountability for the human rights wrongs, but at the same time built up the civil society and the economy of North Korea. There's no doubt they are, like their brothers and sisters and cousins in South Korea, very talented people. South Korea is now the 8th strongest economy in the world. And this is a country which just 30 years ago was really a basically impoverished country. And they've basically done this by their own bootstraps. They've pulled themselves up. They've really developed the electronic industry. They are now a very prosperous country. They've got quite a lot of wealth that they could share with the North. But how we get to the point of generosity of spirit, good sense, and get the message over to them that if only they could get their act together and realign their relationships, then their prosperity would be assured. But we're a long way from that point. But I like to think that in due course of time, the accountability that we gave in our report is a step in the right direction, so that on the basis of truth and what has happened and the very great wrongs that have happened, we can move beyond this and get rid of the nuclear weapons and get rid of the dangers that exist for our region and indeed for our own country with intercontinental ballistic missiles. So that's basically where we stand, and it's not a story with a happy ending yet. We have to hope that we'll get a happy ending, because the alternative is too horrible to contemplate. So we'll have a big round of applause and then we'll have a little Q&A.